Good afternoon. Today I'm going to do a reading of the segment of Liber Secundus, of the Red Book by C.G. Jung, entitled Death. And in this segment, you'll notice some intimations about World War I. This act of imagination took place on January the 2nd, 1914. So it took place about 7 months before the beginning of World War I. And Dr. Jung was feeling in his own psyche the existence of the collective unconscious, but he didn't realize it at that time. It was only later that it became part of his knowledge that he was sharing with the world, but he was definitely experiencing it at this time. And so during times of political difficulty in a country, wherever that may be, you can feel things that are definitely not good, and you can have a sense of how they might end. And so this is Dr. Jung's act of imagination. I'm reading from page 262 of the Red Book Reader's Edition by Dr. C.G. Jung. Death. On the following night, I wandered to the northern land and found myself under a gray sky, in misty haze, cool, moist air. I strive to those lowlands where the weak currents, flashing in broad mirrors, stream toward the sky, where all haste of flowing becomes more and more where all haste of flowing becomes more and more dampened, where all power and all striving unites with the immeasurable extent of the sky. The trees become sparse. Wide swamp meadows accompany the still, murky water. The horizon is unending and lonely, draped by gray clouds. Slowly, with restrained breath, and with the great and anxious expectation of one gliding downward. And with the great and anxious expectation of one gliding downward wildly on the foam and pouring myself into endlessness, I follow my brother, the sea. It flows softly and almost imperceptibly, and yet we continually approach the supreme embrace, entering the womb of the source, the boundless expansion and immeasurable depths. Lower yellow hills rise there. A broad, dead lake widens at their feet. We wander along the hills quietly, and they open up to a dusky, unspeakably remote horizon where the sky and the sea are fused into infinity. Someone is standing there on the last dune. He is wearing a black, wrinkled coat. He stands motionless and looks into the distance. I go up to him. He is gaunt and with a deeply serious look in his eyes. I say to him, "Let me stand behind you. Let me stand beside you for a while, Dark One. I recognized you from afar. There is only one who stands this way, so solitary and at the last corner of the world." He answered, "Stranger, you may well stand by me if it is not too cold for you. As you can see, I am cold and my heart has never beaten. I know you are ice and the end. You are the cold silence of the stones, and you are the highest snow on the mountains and the most extreme frost of outer space. I must feel this, and that's why I stand near you. What leads you here to me, you living matter? The living are never guests here. Well, they all flow past here, sadly, in dense crowds, all those above the land of the clear day, who have taken their departure, never to return again. But the living never come here. What do you seek here? My strange and unexpected path led me here, as I happily followed the way of the living stream, and thus I found you. I gather this is your place, your rightful place. Yes, here it leads into the undifferentiable. Here it leads into the undifferentiable, where none is equal or unequal, but all are one with one another. Do you see what approaches there? I see something like a dark wall of clouds swimming toward us on the tide. Look more closely. What do you recognize? I see densely pressed multitudes of men, old men, women and children. Between them I see horses and oxen and similar animals. A cloud of insects swarms around the multitude. A forest swims nearby. A forest swims near, innumerable faded flowers, an utterly dead summer. They are already near. How stiff and cool they are. How stiff and cool they all look. Their feet do not move. No noise sounds from their closed ranks. They are clasping themselves rigidly. They are clasping themselves rigidly with their hands and arms. They are gazing beyond and pay us no heed. They are all flowing past in an enormous stream. Dark One, this vision is awful. You wanted to stay by me, so get hold of yourself. Look, I see. The first rows have reached the point where the surf and the stream flow together violently, and it looks as if a wave of air were confronting the stream of the dead, together with the surging sea, whirling them up high, scattering them in black scraps, and dissolving them in murky clouds of mist, scattering them in black scraps and dissolving them in murky clouds of mist. Wave after wave approaches, and ever new droves dissolve into black air. Dark One, tell me, is this the end? Look. The dark sea breaks heavily. A reddish glow spreads out in it. It is like blood. A sea of blood foams at my feet. The depths of the sea glow. How strange I feel. I am suspended by my feet. Is it the sea or is it the sky? Blood and fire mix themselves together in a ball. Red light erupts from its smoky shroud. A new sun escapes from the bloody sea and rolls gleamingly toward the uttermost depths. It disappears under my feet. I look around me. I am all alone. Night has fallen. What did Ammonius say? Night is the time of silence. I looked around me and saw what the solitude expanded into, the immeasurable. I looked around me and saw that the solitude expanded into the immeasurable and pierced me with horrible coldness. The sun still glowed in me, but I could feel myself stepping into the great shadow. I follow the stream that makes its way into the depths, slowly and unperturbed, into the depths of what is to come. And thus I went out in that night. It was the second night of the year 1914. An anxious expectation filled me. I went out to embrace the future. The path was wide, and what was to come was awful. It was the enormous dying, a sea of blood. From it, the new sun arose awful and a reversal of that which we call day. We have seized the darkness, and its sun will shine above us, bloody and burning, like a great downfall. When I comprehended my darkness, a truly magnificent night came over me, and my dream plunged me into the depths of the millennia, and from it my phoenix ascended. But what happened in my day? Torches were kindled. Now, I just mentioned that this act of imagination sort of ends at this point, and then Dr. Jung is now in a retrospective where he's talking about what happened in 1914. But what happened in my day? Torches were kindled. Bloody anger and disputes erupted. As darkness seized the world, the terrible war arose, and the darkness destroyed the light of the world, since it was incomprehensible to the darkness and good for nothing anymore. And so we had to taste hell. I saw which vices the virtues of this time changed into, how your mildness became hard, your goodness became brutality, your life became hate, and your understanding became madness. Why did you want to comprehend the darkness? But you had to, or else it would have seized you. Happy the man who anticipates this grasp. Did you ever think of the evil in you? Oh, you spoke of it. You mentioned it, and you confessed it smilingly as a general human vice or a recurring misunderstanding. But did you know what is evil? And that it stands precisely right behind your virtues, that it is also your virtues themselves as their inevitable substance? You locked Satan in the abyss for a millennium, and when the millennium had passed, you laughed at him, since he had become a children's fairy tale. But if the dreadful great one raises his head, the world winces. The most extreme coldness draws near. With horror you see that you are defenseless, and that the army of your vices falls powerless to its knees. With the power of demons you seize the evil, and your virtues cross over to him. You are completely alone in this struggle, since your gods have become deaf. You do not know which devils are greater, your vices or your virtues. But of one thing we are certain, that virtues and vices are brothers. We need coldness of death to see clearly. Life wants to live and to die, to begin and to end. You are not forced to live eternally, but you can also die, since there is a will in you for both. Life and death must strike a balance in your existence. Today's men need a large slice of death, since too much incorrectness lives in them and too much correctness died in them. What stays in balance is correct. That which disturbs balance is incorrect. And that which disturbs it is correct. Balance is at once life and death. For the completion of life, a balance with death is suffered. I'm going to reread a portion of that. I'm having a bit of an experience here where just reading this is putting me into a hypnotic trance, and it's sort of making me fall asleep. It sometimes happens with Dr. Jung's work. What stays in balance is correct. What disturbs balance is incorrect. But if balance has been attained, then that which preserves it is incorrect, and that which disturbs it is correct. Balance is at once life and death. For the completion of life, a balance with death is fitting. If I accept death, then my tree greens, since dying increases life. If I plunge into the death encompassing the world, then my buds break open. How much our life needs death. Joy at the smallest things comes to you only when you have accepted death. But if you look out greedily for all that you could still live, then nothing is great enough for your pleasure. And the smallest things that continue to surround you are no longer a joy. Therefore, I behold death, since it teaches me how to live. If you accept death, it is altogether like a frosty night and an anxious misgiving, but a frosty night in a vineyard full of sweet grapes. You will soon take pleasure in your wealth. Death ripens. One needs death to be able to harvest the fruit. Without death, life would be meaningless, since the long-lasting rises again and denies its own meaning. To be and to enjoy your being, you need death, and limitation enables you to fulfill your being. Hello, Gray. Thank you so much for your kind super chat, and anyone else may feel free to offer a super chat. That's always helpful. I just have half a page left in this section. When I see the lamentation and nonsense of the earth, and consequently enter death with a covered head, then everything I see will indeed turn to ice. But in the shadow world, the other rises, the red sun. It rises secretly and unexpectedly, and my world revolves like a satanic apparition. I suspect blood and murder. Blood and murder alone are still exalted and have their own peculiar beauty. One can assume the beauty of bloody acts of violence. But it is the unacceptable, that awfully repulsive, that which I have forever rejected, that rises in me. For if the wretchedness and poverty of this life ends, another life begins in what is opposed to me. This is opposed to such an extent that I cannot conceive it, for it is opposed not according to the laws of reason, but thoroughly and according to its own nature. Yes, it is not only opposed, but repulsive, invisibly and cruelly repulsive, something that takes my breath away, that drains the power from my muscles, that confuses my senses, stings me poisonously from behind in the stings me poisonously from behind in the heel, and always strikes just where I did not suspect I possessed a vulnerable spot. It does not confront me like a strong enemy, manly and dangerously, but I perish on a dung heap, while peaceful chickens cackle around me, amazedly and mindlessly laying their eggs. A dog passes, lifts its leg over me, then trots off calmly. I curse the hour of my birth 7 times, and if I do not choose to kill myself on the spot, I prepare to experience the hour of my second birth. The ancients said, interfaces et Uranus nascimer. We are born between feces and urine. For 3 nights I was assaulted by the horrors of birth. On the 3rd night, jungle-like laughter pealed forth, for which nothing is too simple. Then life began to stir again. Okay, so that's the end of this section called Death. Thank you all to Alchemy. That's a kind gift. Let me go back and read the footnotes to this now. Okay, so this segment, Death, was handwritten and it was dated January 2nd, 1914, so 7 months before the beginning of World War I, which Dr. Jung had not anticipated. And let's see here. So the text says, blood and fire mix themselves together in a ball. Red light erupts from its smoky shroud. A new sun escapes from the bloody sea and rolls gleamingly toward the uttermost depths. It disappears under my feet. And the footnote reads, see the vision in Liber Primus, chapter 5, Descent into Hell in the Future, page 147 of the Reader's Edition. And then this next one. Sorry, I cannot find the text here, but what I will read is the footnote. In 1940, Jung wrote, evil is relative, partly avoidable, partly fate. The same goes for virtue, and one often does not know which is worse. Except at a psychological interpretation of the dogma of the Trinity, attempt at a psychological interpretation of the dogma of the Trinity, Collected Works 11, paragraph 291. And then, let's see here. So the text says, you locked Satan in the abyss for a millennium, and when the millennium had passed, you laughed at him, since he had become a children's fairy tale. And the footnote reads, this sentence is replaced with, in the corrected draft, evil is one half of the world, one of the two pans of the scale. And then the next footnote, the text reads, we need the coldness of death to see clearly life. To see clearly, life wants to live and to die, to begin and to end. And in the footnote it says, the draft continues, in this bloody battle, death steps up to you, just like today where mass killing and dying fill the world. The coldness of death penetrates you. When I froze to death in my solitude, I saw clearly and saw what was to come, as clearly as I could see the stars and the distant mountains on a frosty night. And then he goes on. Jung had argued that the libido was not only a Schopenhauerian life urge, but contained the contrary striving toward death within itself. And then the text reads, you are not forced to live eternally, but you can also die, since there is a will in you for both. Life and death must strike a balance in your existence. And the footnote reads, the draft continues, to live what is right and to let what is false die. That is the art of life. In 1934, Jung wrote, life is an energetic process like any other, but every energetic process is in principle irreversible and therefore unequivocally directed toward a goal, and the goal is the state of rest. From the middle of life, only he who is willing to die with life remains living, since what takes place in the secret hour of life's midday is the reversal of the parabola, the birth of death. but wanting to live is identical with not wanting to die. Becoming and passing away is the same curve. Soul and Death, Collected Works 8, paragraph 800. And it also says, see my The Boundless Expanse, Jung's Reflections on Life and Death, from Quadrant Journal of C.G. Jung Foundation for Analytical Psychology, volume 38, 2008, pages 9 through 32. Apparently that is a reference to an essay by Sonu Shamdasani. Okay, and so then the text reads, yet it is not only opposed, but repulsive, invisibly and cruelly repulsive, something that takes my breath away, that drains the power from my muscles, that confuses my senses, strings me poisonously from behind in the heel, and always strikes just where I did not suspect I possessed a vulnerable spot. And the footnote reads, in Transformations of and Symbols of the Libido, Jung commented on the motif of the wounded heel. And that's the first version of it was Psychology of the Unconscious, and the later version of it is, it says here, Collected Works B, paragraph 461. And then one other, the ancients said, born between feces and urine, a saying widely attributed to St. Augustine, among others. Okay, so that's the end. I'll come back and take a look at your chats now. Vixen, R says, fish cannot carry guns. Great job, Skip, thank you. Vixen says, it sounds like Apocalypse Now. Is there a possibility of a closed loop between his dreams and his interpretation of them afterward that feeds back into his future dreams? Yep, I suppose so. Grace says, very few days go by that I am not thankful for your work. Thank you for going through this death again. It's always enjoyable to go through death with a magician. Much love. Thank you very much, Gray. Info says, what pages are you reading? Sorry, I was reading pages 262 to 268 of the Red Book Reader's Edition. And let's see, I think this is, just a minute, I'll give you the chapter number. This is chapter 6 of Liber Secundus. And then Grace says, Vixen, all those things are covered at the beginning of the Red Book with the way that is to come and at the beginning of the 7 Sermons to the Dead, right? And Grenade says, what I want to know is how Jung actually put those experiences into words. They must be metaphorical because these things aren't translated well. Well, he was reporting his active imagination, so he was giving us what he had imagined in terms of meeting death, and then he and then he's giving his commentary on it, maybe much later, because I don't think this last part, so what happened in my day, that part, I don't think that part was written in 1914. I think he wrote it much later, maybe after World War I. And I just mention that I had a vision when I was having my knee replaced, and I had been under general anesthesia, and that I was back in my room recovering from the surgery. And so I was in sort of a dreamlike state. And I had this vision of this ball coming toward me, and it was packed tightly with people and beings and animals and so on. It was black, and it was packed extremely tightly. And I have a sense that that might have been something like the vision that Dr. Jung had. And so are these metaphorical? They're real. I mean, events of the unconscious are real. And so Auto Alchemy says, thanks for all you do, Skip. Vixen says, thanks. Grenade says, did the editors omit anything from the published version of the Red Book? I heard some of his work was edited because it might be offensive to certain religions. Well, I think there's plenty that's offensive to almost every religion in one way or another, although it's also very supportive of all religions. What I would say is that, yes, there's a significant amount that has been omitted from the Red Book and from Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And Dr. Shamdasani has said that he's going to publish the Black books probably this year. I mean, he said this a couple of years ago and said he would publish it in 2020. And I'm very much looking forward to that because some time ago he said that he had only included about 1/2 of the material that he had available to him when he edited the Red Book, when he pulled it together. Marcus is surprised that he's on time. That's good. And Zach says, take Robitussin, cough, cold, and congestion, direct max 8-ounce bottle only. Okay, Zach, I'm sorry, but if you're commenting on my sniffles and that sort of thing, I apologize for the way my respiratory system works, but I've had asthma since I was a baby, and now it's fairly mild by comparison to what it was. But at one point, my father got stationed on the Mojave Desert to cure me of it. It's pretty cured. I have asthma at 13%, according to the doctors. But one of the things that happened is I don't have a very big nasal passage. And 22 years ago, I had to have the whole back of my throat removed to include my uvula, so I don't have the little thing that hangs down in the back of my throat. And all of that has to do with severe allergies that I have always had and what caused my asthma in the first place. Info says, when I try active imagination, I can't tell if I am experiencing unconscious processes or if I am projecting experiences into my imagination. Well, it's fairly clear what the difference is. If you're trying to force an imagination or trying to imagine something, that's you. But if it's that's your ego. But if you just go to that place, that dreamlike place, and just observe what happens, which is what happens in a dream, in fact, then that's active imagination. And so there's a qualitative difference. One is forcing, one is receiving. Zach says, you will reach nirvana At least people like us do, because we are the elect of Yahweh in Judeo-Christian light, of course. Okay. And he says, I'm talking about psychedelics. Okay, well, I don't know the point of the psychedelics here. We don't promote psychedelics on this YouTube channel. Grenade says, drink cough syrup to reach nirvana. Yeah, not quite. Okay, we're going to stop the discussion of the psychedelics here. Yeah, I'm not, I mean, there's a lot of conversation here about psychedelics that I'm not going to repeat. And I'll probably have to hide this chat from the playback, but it's definitely not necessary to do them. And even though it is true that Johns Hopkins and other major research institutions are using psychedelics as a way to help people with mental health issues, especially schizophrenia, I guess, among other things, you really have to do that under the supervision of a professional. And you know, I've had 3 people in my close knowledge. People, you know, one is well, I'm not going to say who it is, but people that are close enough to me to be relatives. And 3 of them have died from drug overdoses in the last 3 years. And so you just have to be extremely careful and don't get into this without a professional. That's what I would say. It's very cavalier to be talking about using psychedelics if you're not a professional. And then Grenaz. Okay. Yeah. Grace's basic idea, don't confuse the ticket for the show. And I would say that's right on. And, you know, I know that a lot of people have had you know, out-of-body experiences and all kinds of experiences under the influence of drugs. But you know, it's really dangerous unless you do it with the help of a professional who knows what to take. And, you know, we see a perfect example of that in Jordan Peterson, because he is a professional. He's been a professional psychologist for over 2 decades. And yet he himself got hooked and ended up having to go to detox. And so you can't, even if you're with a professional doing it, sometimes it can cause trouble. And so, you know, these are very powerful things without even doing that. You know, Grenade says the real experience is like a trip to end all trips. Well, that's what a religious experience is, a numinous experience. And you can have such experiences very easily without the help of psychedelics. And no drugs involved, says Grenade. And so, you know, that's in Synchronicities. It's in a lot of Dr. Jung's work, but he never promoted drugs. Grace says, Skip, can you elaborate about the dead in the Scrutinies and how they rejected these notions of death Jung was elaborating on here? Well, I can elaborate on the dead in the sense that we are all, I mean, one dictum was that we are all lived by our dead. And so all of us have people that have died that need something. They don't need it in the physical sense, but in the psyche, in your psyche, they may need something. And so in Dr. Jung's case, because he was involved in mental health and had been doing clinical psychology with people, he had a lot of dead in his experience. And, you know, just today I was reading the first chapter of Memory Streams Reflections, which we're going to discuss on Monday night. And he was talking about when he was a little boy at age 4, he kept ending up at funerals that his father was officiating at, and his 8 uncles who were also pastors. And so all these guys in black coats would come, and there'd be a hole in the ground, and they'd bury somebody. And so Dr. Jung had a lot of dead in his career. And so in the case of the Scrutinies, and let me just, and we're talking about the 7 sermons to the dead here. And let me just talk about one of the very first concepts that appears in the very beginning of the Scrutinies, is that Dr. Jung imagines this horde of dead people coming to his door, and they knock on the door and they say, "We have been to Jerusalem where we did not find what we sought." And basically, to me, now in the fullness of time, to me that means you can't go to the Holy Land or to Jerusalem, which I have done. And let me just show your reply there, right? You can't go to the Holy Land and expect that something magical is going to happen. The magic has to come within you and your own psyche. And so that's the point about the Logos world. The Logos world is a skeleton. It's a structure. So every book is a structure to try to make your mind go through certain hoops, right? And so every book is like that. It's making your mind go through certain things. But how that influences you is a matter of your life. It's a matter of eros. And so the point is that the reason Christianity has had difficulties in the last century and a half, let's say, because it certainly didn't start with Zarathustra, and actually probably 500 years it's been happening. The reason it has had difficulties is it entirely relied on the word. Word is with God, and the point about religion is that, okay, you have words, but it has to be lived. And it actually says that in John 1 through 14. If you read those verses, yes, John 1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Okay, the Word was God. Okay, God is something. Anyway, whether he's a word is a question. But then if you read the next few verses, it's very clear that Jesus represented the light and the life. It wasn't a structure. It wasn't, scaffolding. It was him there physically touching people in their heart. And so in the case of the dead here, now let me go back to your question, Ray. So the point is that the dead require our life to fulfill the meaning of their lives. Okay, and so as many of you know, my roommate in basic school was killed in Vietnam 5 months after we graduated as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. And I have always felt a couple of things. Number one, his death makes me appreciate my life more fully, more beautifully, obviously. But I feel an obligation to fulfill the meaning of his life, which was his sacrifice of his life. And, you know, when I see the disregard of certain politicians in our country for the meaning of that life and the meaning of our country and what we have in the United States, I want to be physically ill. I mean, it's really horrific to see what is going on and how people will just close their minds to information. And so, you know, I feel a need because of Bob's death to say what I just said to you, okay, just now, okay, that is part of the meaning of his life, in that he gave his life for something that is way more meaningful than certain politicians in our country have come even close to understanding. And, you know, the question is, are we smart enough to know it? And this point in time that we're talking about, where Dr. Jung is prefiguring the collective unconscious in Europe just before World War I tell you, I feel those things now and premonitions. And so what happened in his time? Well, there was a horrific war, and the Allies were very punitive of the Germans after the war. And the result was that the Germans came back and wanted revenge. And it wasn't until after all the crockery was broken, which was 41 years or 31 years later, between 1914 and 1941, finally, when all the crockery was broken, then people resumed a normal life. And the second time around, the Allies rebuilt Western Europe, including Germany and including Japan, we rebuilt. And so therefore, Germany and Japan today are among our strongest allies, whereas at the end of World War I, we forced the German people into destitution and poverty. And the 1920s in Germany was really ugly. And so it's a cautionary tale, because if we don't hold together our civilization as it's come up to us, if we don't stand for our Constitution, if we don't stand for our country, then we're going to have a very, very bad time going forward, in my opinion. And, you know, it's not hard to be a prophet like that. If it seems to me, if our current president is reelected this fall, watch out, because he's going to have no stops on him anymore. And that will be exactly like Adolf Hitler being elected with the biggest majority in the history of Germany before Angela Merkel. he in 1933 or early 34, he was elected with the biggest majority of a chancellor. Everybody thought he was the greatest thing ever. And 11 years later, Germany was destroyed as a result. And, you know, we need to pay attention. We had a very bad time like that too, in the Civil War. And, you know, something like 800,000 men and women were killed in the Civil War. And, you know, the South was completely destroyed. And you know, there was lots of death and destruction. And this is one bit of a criticism I have for the movie Little Women, because it really soft pedaled what was going on in the Civil War. And so anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, Gray, but that's my homily that was lit off by your question. Terrence says, it is interesting to see Jung unite the discussion of personal death and collective death in a single vision and its commentary. I wonder if war can be said to be a failed collective individuation. I think that's absolutely true. I think war is a failed collective individuation. And, you know, look, humans were developing up, and for thousands of years, they were dividing up the territory of the earth. And that's now been done. Okay, and so by human nature, we developed in a certain way so that there's a certain warlike attitude that certain parts of our species have, including in the United States, of course. But we've come to a new time, when we have to come to a new stage of consciousness. And that stage of consciousness is that there's no more territory to be had. Yes, you could start a war and go grab somebody's territory, but that just is going to start revenge and counter-revenge back and forth. And that goes on ad infinitum. As Mohandas Gandhi said, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. And so a lot of the point of what I've been doing with this YouTube channel is to try to get people to wake up, you know, be awake and understand what we have to do in the future. And so, you know, very large percentage of all humanity still thinks we're living in the old way, and we're not. That those ways can't succeed anymore. And, you know, the biggest attempt to make them succeed was Nazi Germany and Japan in China, what they did, which was genocidal. And humanity can't tolerate that and won't tolerate it. I mean, definitely, if somebody starts to do that kind of thing, you know, humanity is going to start to stand up and resist. And even this week, we have the United Nations telling the Burmese, the Myanmar government, that they have to stop persecuting the Rohingya, who they've been killing. And, you know, I don't know if that's going to be, if Myanmar is going to adopt that view. They may think that the UN is toothless, but I can tell you, if the types of stuff that happened in Western Europe in World War II comes where we have to pay attention to it here in the United States or in Western Europe, then there's going to be big changes, and it may not all be good. And we have to recognize that the last time around, it was not pretty, okay? And there were 175 million people killed by warlike violence in the 20th century, 175 million. And some people say that number is more like 300 million. And, you know, we have the potential now to wipe out a large part of the earth. So we have to wake up to what we are and help our fellow men do that. And, you know, if something bad happens to you, everybody has a vengeful instinct somewhere, but we have to rise above that. We have to find a way to rise above that. If we can't, we're going to be cooked. So Blue Red says, the main thing is whether the connection is encrypted or not. Who knows what beings are tampering and manipulating the information we receive while using the psychedelic. I wouldn't recommend it either, okay? Okay, I'm sorry, the chat jumped on me. And so then Info says, didn't Jung warn against the use of psychedelics? I thought he said something, beware of unearned wisdom. Yes, he did say. And as Grace says, beware of wisdom you haven't earned. Terrence says, I think that we must interpret we are all lived by our dead more symbolically. Obviously, it's a symbolic statement in any case. Even people who are still alive can be part of our dead, yes, if we transform them into symbolic experiences. And, you know, we can bring them back to life too. And Terrence says, the dead that Jung sees in this chapter are not yet dead because it is a vision of the future and the future war. Our dead are also in the future, not just in the past. Yes, definitely. You know, I republished at least my essay, There Will Be Blood, the day after or around the time that our president was elected. Anthony Roberts says, no one talks about World War I ended the Ottoman Empire as well, nor how that continues to drive policy 100 years later. Well, a lot of people have been talking about it, but most politicians are so ignorant that they don't understand that, you know, we've caused a lot of this, or, you know, Western democracies have caused a lot of this. I mean, it's not pretty what happened at the end of World War I with Winston Churchill and how he divided up the Middle East in ways that were not appropriate. And Anthony says, ironically, Merkel will be the downfall of Germany as well. Could be. Granada, hopefully we can settle our disputes in negotiation now that our global culture is a bit more homogenized. Yeah, I hope so. The lines of sand have been drawn. Yeah, we have to be respectful of the fact that lines have been drawn in the sand, and people still need to live one way or another. And Anthony says to Granada, I believe that is wishful thinking. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative will not be altruistic, and they're building defenses and claiming territory. The Chinese are still operating in an old world type of way, definitely. And, you know, they've done a lot with their Uyghurs in the middle of China, who are out of sight, out of mind for most of us. And then we have the Myanmar situation and the Rohingyas and many others. But things are going to get a lot worse in the 21st century because China controls the water that goes down into India. And things, if there's a war between China and India, it's going to be a big deal, and it's going to involve the United States as well, because we have so many Indian refugees that are now Americans. And so it's not something that we're going to be able to ignore. John says, Hamlet realizes forgiveness was more important than the revenge of his father. The archetype of avenging our fathers. He became calm in the last stanza when he saw himself in Laertes, yes. And Antony says, wars don't happen overnight. They take years of planning and positioning before the opportunity presents itself. Yeah, if you can call it an opportunity, we have to try to resist that. And, nobody wants to fight a war in the military, in any military, but some people have to know how, until we can raise the consciousness of our species to the point where we can start to reduce the danger. And pulling back from the danger isn't a question of just, okay, let's have a treaty about nuclear weapons and everything is going to be hunky-dory. It's not going to work like that. We human beings are going to have to slowly back away from the kind of confrontations that we had in the 20th century. And if we don't, we're going to destroy ourselves and all the life on this planet as well. Simple as that. And Grenade says, yes, I don't suspect we have seen our last war yet, but with the highest amount of nuclear weaponry in human history now circulating, my worst fear is another global conflict causing desperation. Well, that's right. And, I don't doubt that some hothead at some point might pull the trigger on a nuclear weapon. And I suppose we can see that sort of thing happen even in my lifetime. And I don't relish the idea. But I mean, I can't say for other countries, but I can say for the United States, and to a limited extent to the former Soviet Union, that the people that have control of our weapons are very carefully trained and screened, and they don't just use nuclear weapons on a whim. And, our president, before he took office, was saying, well, why don't we just go ahead and use nuclear weapons? Well, since he's been in office, I think he's been advised what the consequences can be. And so I haven't been hearing him say that sort of thing lately, but I can tell you that the people that control such weaponry are not crazies by and large, not only in the United States, but also in Russia, because they had the sense to pull back of it and from it. And the movie 13 Days does a good job of explicating that, because you see a scene between Bobby Kennedy and the Russian that he's back channeling with. And the Russian says, let's hope we can stop this thing from getting farther. Well, this thing that he's talking about is a psychic epidemic, is what has caused previous wars and caused crazy attitudes to go out. I mean, what happened in Nazi Germany, what happened in Japan were psychic epidemics, no doubt. And you know, by and large, we don't understand that yet. That's why I'm here. That's one of the main objectives of this YouTube channel, is so that we can understand that there's a lot more to what Dr. Jung was talking about than just what happens in a clinical mental health situation between a Jungian analyst and an individual. We all have to start thinking about these things, absolutely. And otherwise, we're just going to destroy ourselves. If over it says, how do we revivify dead symbols? Well, the answer is we don't, okay? Because a symbol has to be living. And a symbol is created when there is a set of opposites and they need to be reconciled. And the psyche, and this can be the collective unconscious too, the collective psyche, from the collective psyche emerges a symbol, okay? And so Martin Luther King Jr. is a perfect example of that, because he saw in his wisdom that the way to solve the problem for our Black Americans was to make it so all Americans perceive one another as equal. And he knew that that couldn't happen through violence. It could only happen through just living and letting people see that our Black Americans are not threatening. Of course, there are threatening Black Americans, but there are certainly very threatening white Americans too, going right to the top. And so, you know, we can't just point a finger at somebody and say it's you and it's not me. It's all of us. It's the shadow of all of us in our collective unconscious. And so we need to step back from that. And, you know, the 20th century and what happened after World Wars I and II are a perfect demonstration of the type of thing that has to happen. We can't be vengeful. We can't be punitive. We have to let people see that the future is going to be something different, and needs to be something different. Because if you don't, if you're just going to have vengeance back and forth, then, as Gandhi said, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. So let's see. Napoleon says, and so I don't know what the symbol will be. I think Martin Luther King Jr. Is a symbol who emerged, and we now see, for example, many black anchors and commentators on mainstream media, and they're just commentators like any other, and they've incorporated themselves into the American way of life, and so they're literally living the dream, maybe not perfectly yet, and that's, you know, that can take another century or more, but they are the living examples of what the symbol of Dr. King is, in my view. Well, Napoleon said, I've been having recurring dreams all my life of a snarling and vicious sea. It's always snapping at my heels, but doesn't consume me. Are the seas being stirred once again? Well, they are, but what we need to do is turn around on that sea. Okay, in other words, the way to resolve it is not to try to run away from it, but to turn on it and face it. We have to swim in that sea, because that sea represents the collective unconscious. And so we need to face it and learn how to swim in it. And, just in the same sense that, we all know that there are great white sharks in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, but most of us still go to the seashore every so often and swim in the sea. And so we have to face that fear, obviously. And so a sea that's snapping at your heels is a sea that you need to learn to swim in. And Dr. Jung talked to James Joyce about the schizophrenia of his daughter and said that Joyce, in his writing, could swim in the sea, okay, and that's how he could write a book like Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake, but his daughter, who was schizophrenic, couldn't. She was drowning in it. And so we need to teach people to swim. And so what I've been saying lately is, if you listen to the talking heads on cable news, you'd think that Americans are at each other's throats, and that's simply not true. Go to the grocery store. There are people of every religion, race, creed, color, national origin everywhere in our society, and it works. Largely it works. I mean, I'm not saying that there are no exceptions. Of course there are exceptions, but largely we live in peace and we live well together. We have a national psyche that does work and is going to continue to work. And so the people that are going around saying, well, we're never going to be back to something like when Christianity was king type thing. No, we're not. We're going to have something better. And we already do have, if we only look at it and see it. And so, if you're sitting at your television set, gripping your AR-15, then maybe your mental health is being troubled by what you're watching on TV, and you might want to turn off your television and just pay attention to what's really happening in our country, because it's not that. I'm not saying it can't happen, but the people that say we're going to have a civil war in this country, I don't think are right at all. And I'm not saying we won't have some violent dust-ups. Obviously, that does happen from time to time. And, I can't be responsible for everyone. But if we look at our country, by and large, we live quite well and we live together quite well. It's not perfect. It's a mess. But, that's the mess is what makes our country the strongest in the world. Grenade says there has to be a consensus between multiple high clearance individuals to even unlock the launch protocol, but under certain dire circumstances, these things can be usurped. It's hard, Grenade, and to usurp them. And there was a time during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I believe it was, when a Russian submarine commander almost launched, and one officer on that submarine stopped that from happening. And so I'm not saying that we're perfect, and And it may come down to somebody making a sacrifice, which he did. But he stopped a nuclear war, literally. And we were moments from midnight on that one. And we're all trained. Even I was trained about these things, and this is why we have officers that we can trust, and it's why people don't get the responsibility until they've been at every level of command, so they know everything all the way up. And so a situation like that would be aberrational, definitely. But of course, that doesn't protect us from the possibility that we might elect somebody who's not mentally well in a civilian office, and we have to look at that. Sean Smith says, Jung symbols seem alive to me. Yes, I agree with that. And Info says, do you still think that Christ sits on the symbol of the self? If not, what does? Is it even possible to be conscious of it? Well, it's absolutely possible to be conscious of it if you even understand what Dr. Jung was talking about in that, and he wrote about it quite extensively in Ion. And yes, I do think that Christ represents that if we understand it. And I read Dr. Edinger's book entitled An Archetypal Reading of the New Testament, or something like that, which you can find on the homepage of this YouTube channel. So I read that entire book, and if you understand Christianity in that way, not in the way of oh God, oh, we have this sky god, or we have this kindly Geppetto who's pulling our strings. That's not God. Okay, the God that we've been sold through Christianity is not God. Okay, it's simply, okay. It's an approximation of God. It's the best that could have been done by human beings during the 2 millennia of the Christian era. But now that God is simply not, it's simply not God. Okay, there's not a being that's watching over us. There's not a physical being. Nobody's ever going to find a physical being that is God. And to the extent we've been sold that view of what Christianity means, that has to be changed. We have to reevaluate the entire Christian doctrine in an appropriate manner. And, that's what Dr. Jung called for in answer to Job. Nobody's heard him up till now. And so we have to think about that. But if we understand what these things really are, then we can, those symbols can be revivified to the extent that they have lost their shine. Greta Thunberg, Terrence says, Greta Thunberg is a living symbol, and the whole world needs to change, not just not just one nation or a coalition of nations. Absolutely. And Greta Thunberg is a living symbol. There's no doubt about that, of what has to happen. And Sean says, I think Jung compared the madness like this. You dove into the river and she fell in. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's basically what he said to James Joyce, and she's drowning and you're swimming. So we all have to learn to swim in this new environment, and that means raising ourselves to a new level of consciousness. It doesn't mean what John Vervaeke says, that, oh, we're not going back to those old religions. That's not what it means, okay? Because those old religions, all of them, okay, not only Christianity, not only Judaism, but all religions are naturally evolved methods for mental health. That's what they are. And we have to go back and re-understand them in that way, because they're naturally evolved. So they're natural to the way we actually are. Okay, here's one important thing. Dr. Jung was talking about the way we really are, okay, as human beings, as creatures, as animals. We think in images, okay? We think in images and symbols. That's the way we think. That was his insight, and that's absolutely correct from my perspective. I mean, that's my whole life I can look back on and know that always I've seen in images. Now, by that I don't mean pictures. I mean, you can have, if I mention a piece of music, whatever I mention, you will have an image of it. And that image involves being able to hear the notes and maybe see an image of someone playing that piece of music. But you know, if we take, let's say Paul Simon's song Kodachrome, which is a favorite one for me to refer to right now because it relates to John Vervaeke's getting over the meaning crisis. And what does that song begin with? It begins with the line, "When I think of all the crap I had to learn in high school, it's a wonder I could think at all." Okay, and so what John Vervaeke was trying to do in his 50 videos was he was trying to give you a definition of meaning, but that's not what the meaning crisis is about. The meaning crisis is about the meaning of your life, the meaning of my life, the meaning of your life, the meaning of the life of the nation. And those things are not logos, those are eros, and you cannot make a dictionary definition that everybody's going to buy in on, because everybody will have a different point of view. So, you know, although Vervaekian, like the last 2 minutes of lecture 50 kind of indicated that he knew all this, but he piled on for 50 lectures all this logos stuff, which is like taking a skeleton and building up this skeleton more and more and thinking that you're going to have something at the end. At this end, you still have a skeleton. You don't have life. I mean, that's why nothing was lost when Notre Dame burned, okay? Nothing was lost in terms of theology, nothing at all, because Notre Dame and even all the beautiful art that was lost, that, you know, there was art lost, there were priceless pieces lost, but all of that had to do with the skeleton of the Christian church and of Catholicism. It didn't have to do with theology, okay? And so it finally dawned on me a week after the fire that nothing had been lost, and that actually now living people, living artisans are going to rebuild Notre Dame just as good or better than it was before. and it will be a boon to living people. And yes, I'm sorry that those things were lost, but no life was lost in that fire. And there was nothing lost from a theological point of view. And so, we have to think about these things. So Terrence says, for the spirit of the times, she is just a kid, talking about Greta. For the spirit of the depths, she is a symbol, hence the attention and the polarization of love and hate. Yes, I agree with that point. And Bernard says, yes, she has embodied an archetype at the collective level, but that has to do with the collective. At the individual level, she's still just a kid who has gotten more attention than she anticipated. And yes, that's absolutely true. And she personally runs the risk of suffering from an inflation. And, somebody once said, there's nothing more terrible than a genius represented at age 25. And example would be Orson Welles, who produced Citizen Kane when he was 25 years old, and won Best Picture that year, and so he largely had what people thought was a tragic life thereafter, because he couldn't match that height. I mean, he had a lucky hit, but and he had a lucky hit with War of the Worlds. But beyond that, what do we think of Orson Welles for? Good question. I mean, I'm not gonna put shade on Orson Welles because he was a brilliant man, but the point is that you can get yourself overinflated, and that can lead to tragedy. And so that's the risk of somebody like Greta having, she was the right person at the right time, but she still has to live a life. And you look at a movie like The Aviator as an example, where Howard Hughes was this wheeler dealer, and look at how his life turned out, and so on. So, you have to keep yourself connected with reality, and so you have to, this is why in the Roman legions, when the legion would come back to Rome, they actually wouldn't let the legion come back into Rome until they had spent like a month or two outside of town, just calming down and getting connected back to Earth. And remember the story that the leader of the legion would come back into Rome in a chariot with a slave in the chariot with them, and the job of the slave was to say over and over to him, "Remember, all glory is fleeting," and that's what we do have to remember. Actually, this program, The Crown, which recently won a couple of, I guess it was SAG Awards or Golden Globes, but whichever it was, or maybe it was both, the fourth episode of that is very interesting. I watched it last night, and the name of the episode is called Coup, C-O-U-P, coup d'etat, like coup d'etat. And what it depicts is Lord Mountbatten conspiring with some business tycoons and such to overthrow the British government. And the Queen had to step in and stop them. And he was her second cousin or something, and he was like 40 years older than she was, and he had been, he was an admiral with an extra four stripes up his sleeve. He was the head of the armed forces of Great Britain, and she had to come step in and stop him. And that's a very interesting episode. I urge you to take a look at it. It's on Netflix. And so, anyway, Info says the self is like God because it conducts the strings within our psyche, is like the person behind the scenes. Is this why it is compared to God? Yeah, I mean, it's the other pole, and it's the boss of the psyche. And so Jung is the only developer of a psychology who realized that there were two parts, and that the self was really the one that was in control, and it's unconscious. And so remember in Dr. Jung's letter to David Cox, he said, putting his cards on the table, that God is the unconscious. Well, okay, there's the personal God. That would be the God that you envision, or the God that's pulling your strings in your own psyche. But then the collective unconscious can be seen as God from Dr. Jung's point of view. And God teaches us. Okay, the collective unconscious teaches us, and we learn things through blood, unfortunately. And so when you, for example, say the Lord's Prayer, that's not a petition to somebody up here. That's a petition to you in your heart. And Dr. Edinger, you can put in the search Lord's Prayer on this YouTube channel, and you can hear Dr. Edinger's 7 petitions that come up in the Lord's Prayer, and they're really petitions to your own psyche. So when the football player ends up at the goal line and he makes his touchdown and he points up here, he should have been pointing in here, okay? Because it's that God that got him into the gym, that gave him the strength and the speed to get that touchdown. It wasn't Geppetto. Okay, Lisa, that's, I'm being a little bit facetious here, but Info says, I think Nietzsche had a bit of ego inflation. You can see it in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Okay, yeah, he did. He was also mentally ill. He had syphilis. I'm not going to get into Nietzsche. I mean, if you read any of Nietzsche, as Dr. Edinger said, as soon as you read Nietzsche, you know that it's morbid. In other words, it's mentally ill, because if you get Zarathustra or any of the other books and listen to it, it's like, and you say, oh my God, how do you hold that together? And you can just tell that that's not a healthy psyche. And as Dr. Edinger said, Dr. Jung knew immediately that it was morbid, and it was. he was ill. And so Sean says, that is because the artist creates barricades and can no longer live free. One must live free to catch a glimmer of the truth. Barricades can protect you from the outside world, but you can never be free. So much about unlearning with age that everyone has to go through, not just artists. Yep, everybody has to go through it. In fact, I was a couple of sessions ago when I was reading the Red Book, the Anchorite says to Jung, have you ever tried to unlearn anything? Well, we have to unlearn quite a few things. And Batuhan says, much love from Ankara, Turkey. Info overdose. Jung would certainly agree. He implies this repeatedly in his seminars on Zarathustra. And then Nina Anna. So anyway, hello, Batuhan Erdogan. Are you a relation to the president? I will say nothing. Nina says, good evening from the UK. Thank you for your work. I really enjoy it. I have had the Red Book for a while. Not easy to grasp. Well, the important thing to remember about the Red Book was that this was Dr. Jung's experience. It's not intended to teach you anything other than the fact that you can have an experience maybe not exactly like this. And so it actually happened to me 16 years before the Red Book was published. I had a visioning experience which emerged as a novel, and it lasted 8 months, and it was absolutely archetypal. I couldn't stop it, and it played through until it was done. Okay, in other words, my character had a story she wanted to tell. She was a character in my unconscious, and I could not sleep or stop until I had written her story. And I didn't know what it meant, and I didn't know what it meant for me. It was only when the Red Book was published and I said, oh my goodness, here's Dr. Jung as one of the leading psychiatrists of the 20th century who had an experience like mine. And so that really made me sit up and pay attention. And so, you know, all human beings can have these experiences. They're not the same, but you can see, I mean, what Dr. Jung brilliantly did was uncover in his own being, in his own unconscious, huge wisdom, and it was in him all along, and he was able to bring it out, and that's what the Red Book is. And at one point, about 4 or 5 years ago, I was trying to figure out how I was going to work to make my work come to the attention of others, let's say. And so at one point I decided, okay, since people are tweeting out the Bible, I'll tweet out the Red Book. And so I would find very wise passages that would be like a paragraph long. And because if you just tweet it in order, let's say there's 5 sentences in a paragraph. So if you tweeted it sentence 1, sentence 2, sentence 3, you know, somebody that was looking at it right then could follow you. But if they looked at your timeline afterward, it would be in reverse order. So what I decided I would do is I'd take a paragraph like that with 5 sentences, and I would start with the last sentence and tweet it backwards, so that once I had completed it, and this would take 5 or 10 minutes to put that paragraph in. Once I completed it in my timeline, it would read correctly as it appears in the Red Book. And the interesting thing that I discovered when I did that was that not only is there a lot of wisdom in the Red Book in many different ways, but it makes absolutely equal sense whether you read it backwards or forwards. and that was quite a revelation to me. So it's not easy to grasp, but you take it a step at a time and read up on Dr. Jung, what he was saying. If you're a beginner, I urge you to read Man and His Symbols and also Memory Streams Reflections to get a start before you go into the Red Book. The Red Book is a very hard place to start because it's not like any other kind of writing that you might have read. Gernard says, those barricades are also used to categorize the world into finer and finer detail, which is incredibly useful only when someone gets those confused with the indivisible unity of reality, is when neurosis appear, right? The boundaries are overlaid onto the environment by the psyche. Grace says, reading the Red Book changes the way you think. I hope so, because we need to change the way we think into a higher level of consciousness, the fifth level of consciousness. And so there are multiple levels of consciousness, and most of us aren't anywhere near the level we need to be. And so let me just review what the 5 levels or the 7 levels are, let's say, so that you have a sense of it. So level 1 is participation mystique, participation mystique. And that's when you're an infant and you gain awareness that something's happening outside your body, and this kind goddess comes along and puts a nipple in your mouth, and eating is good. And so you just observe for like 3 years, and you're a wild animal when you're born, and you have to learn what it means to be a child in a family, let's say. And then the second level is that you think of your parents as gods. And I specifically remember when I was 5 years old, realizing that I was in the car with a goddess when my mother was driving me across the United States. I remember when that happened to me. And so then in the third level, you project God on an institution like the church in the way the church has always been taught. And, that has a certain value for a period of time. But by the middle of the 19th century, this was in serious trouble because of the scientific method having punched holes in the Christian myth, and people not understanding that it's not about everything being in the physical world. There's also the psyche. And so, as Dr. Jung said in paragraph 752 of Answer to Job, every religious statement of whatever kind is a statement of the psyche. It is not a statement of the physical world. So in that sense, every religious statement is true for somebody. And so that makes everything in the Bible true. But it's true in the psychic sense, in the mental health sense. It's not true in the physical world. And that's a big problem that we've had within Christianity lately, where people want to say, yes, all these miracles, physically happened. Well, no, not really. And so the problem became toward the 20th century that there were so many holes in the myths that people started to become atheist and agnostic because they couldn't quite countenance the fact that Mary was a virgin type thing. And so we didn't have the glue to hold society together, which we had in previous centuries. And don't get me wrong, the birth of Christ is a miracle, okay? And the miracle was that the people around Mary believed the dream she had, okay, including her betrothed Joseph. That was a miracle, okay, and it would still be a miracle today in some countries in that part of the world, but it definitely was a miracle 2,000 years ago. It wasn't the miracle that you think it was based on what you learned in Bible study, however, probably. Okay, so that created a lot of atheists and agnostics, and so everybody's all bouncing around thinking that we just have to grab everything we can get, and that's what life is about. Well, that's not what life is about, because you can't, you can never get enough, and meanwhile you cause tremendous suffering if you do that, not only for yourself but for everyone around you. And so that's the next level. The fourth level was this agnostic atheist interlude. And so the fifth level is to understand that every religion is true. Every religion is a naturally evolved system for mental health. And what we need to do is go back and reinterpret everything in all religions to know what is good and useful and what is not good and useful. And that's a tremendous task that's going to take 200 years, 500 years, I don't know how long, but all religious doctrine has to be interpreted based on what we know about science, but including the idea that the psyche is real and certain things happen. And so when Dr. Jung is talking about the divine drama, he's talking about the way our psyche develops happens in a certain way from an evolutionary point of view, and that is expressed in the story of Christ's life, okay, in archetypal relief. And so if you understand what that story is about, or what the story of Faust is about, I'm getting interested in doing some readings from Faust now, because if you understand what those stories are about you. Those stories are about the meaning of your life. And they're not about people 2,000 years ago. Yeah, it was about them, but they were relatively primitive people that really didn't know what was happening to them. Now, thanks to Dr. Jung and others, we have an idea what was happening to them and why they felt it was necessary to write it down, why Michelangelo painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel the way he did, okay, because those are images that are in the psyche and they resonate with everyone, okay. And so that's what that's about. Now, I can't speak to all religions, but I know enough about a few of them so that I know that they're all that in different strengths. And so what we need to do is understand one another. So that's the fifth level of consciousness, the fifth stage that we need to arise to. And we haven't done it yet, okay, or at least most of us haven't done it yet. So let's see. Let's see. And John says, the tweeting of the Red Book sounds like it was healing like painting is for you. Yes, I agree with that. I'm not sure I've gotten back to everything here, but let me go on. Info says, do you plan on giving any more talks like you did at Unity? By the Bay, I was very fascinated about the history of mandalas and how far back they go and how fish create them. It proves Jung's theory of archetypes. Absolutely, I think that. Terrence says, I think that, and the answer to your question, Info, is I might do another one at some point. I just have to have some sort of insight into what it would be about. It took me 3 months to write that talk. And so I'm trying to figure out what it would be. I mean, I've put things together from time to time. I wrote a book called Tsunami of Blood in 2007, and I wrote another book called Political Psychology in 2014. And so I feel like Dr. Jung, I have to wait until I get pushed to do it. And probably took me a year to see that I wanted to do that and actually do it. And unfortunately, it was, in one way, it was a waste because I had intended it for it to be professionally videographed. And I actually hired a wedding videographer to come and do a good job of it. And unfortunately, the night before the event, he crapped out on me for one reason or another. And so he didn't videograph it. And so I had to go with what I had, which was just another video off my, off my iPad. So anyway, so Terrence says, I think that Jung was involuntarily projecting the danger of his own inner madness on Nietzsche, and so is not a good guide to Nietzsche on this point. Yeah, I mean, arguably that's true. Terrence then goes on, I see no morbidity or inflation in Zarathustra, and in fact, Nietzsche took great pains to disidentify with Zarathustra. The Spake Zarathustra is a very carefully composed work with manuscripts showing many stages of rewriting. Yeah, I don't mean to throw stones at that. I actually like Zarathustra very much, particularly the ending. And I actually have written a couple of essays that are based on Zarathustra, including one called Donald Trump and the Rope Dancer, or maybe Donald Trump as the Rope Dancer. Anyway, if you go to archetypeinaction.com and put in Rope Dancer, you'll probably get that essay if you want to read it. And so, yeah, I mean, Nietzsche was brilliant. He was way more intelligent than most everybody, no doubt about it. You know, unfortunately, he had syphilis, and so that had an effect on his mental health. And I think that Jung, I agree with you that Jung probably was afraid of that happening to him. And, you know, but he was obviously very influenced by Nietzsche's work. It is not comparable to the Red Book, which expresses a younger Jung's active imagination, but it is the fruit of Nietzsche's maturity, and so is closer to Jung's Mysterium. Yeah, well, Mysterium is a much more scholarly work, and you know, Nietzsche's work is more like in the form of a novel kind of thing, whereas Mysterium is a very scholarly work that's trying to show us what images were in the psyche before epistemological criticism. Thank you, Granat. That's kind of you. And let's see. Grace says, also Skip, when you give the talks like Info Overdose was speaking of, let's dress you up like Philemon and sell tickets. Yeah, if you want to organize a meeting, I'll be happy to come. I even have a few thobes from my time in the Middle East. Wouldn't be hard to dress me up like Philemon. In fact, I've been thinking about writing a one-man show where I play Jung and grow a gray mustache type thing. But I haven't figured out what I would say in such a one-man show. It could be pretty interesting though. Anyway, we need one. So if somebody hears this on the playback and wants to write a one-man show about Jung, there's probably a market for it. Jung says, I think Jung discussed Nietzsche when he was too young to fully withdraw his projections and gain psychic objectivity. That's probably true. I mean, there's certain truth in that. Skip, that's really weird. I've been trying to memorize Faust, probably all your devil calligraphy. Yeah. Yeah, well, there's another YouTube channel called, I forget what it's called offhand, but they've been publishing some of Dr. Edinger's radio talks or recorded voice audible talks, and one of them is excellent, and it's Dr. Edinger talking about Faust. And I really highly recommend that. I don't have the link for it right now, but I'm sure you can find it on YouTube. It's about an hour lecture, and he breaks Faust down into 10 parts that he thinks are important. And so I recently got a used copy of Faust, the one that he recommended, the Norton annotated version of it. I don't have it right here because it's out on my dining table right now. But in any case, it seems to be a very, very interesting book and has a couple hundred pages of commentary with it. And so I'm thinking about getting into it further. I do want to get through the rest of the Red Book, the part that I haven't read yet. And I can tell you how much I haven't read yet because I know. And let's see. Okay. I haven't gotten to the Gift of Magic yet, which is very important, and the Magician. So I am currently on page 268. I have 190 pages left to read. I have read all of Scrutinies, and I have read all of Liber Primus, and I'm maybe 100 pages into Liber Secundus. So I still have 190 pages to read. That's probably going to take me another month to get through. But meanwhile, I'm going to be working with Faust and seeing what I can do with that, and maybe I'll read it. There is a reading of Faust on audible.com, and I'm not thinking of replicating that. They're just trying to tell you what the theater version of Faust was like. So they're just reading the play. I want to talk about the psychological issues that come up in Faust, and and the things that Jung was interested in around Goethe's play, and what Dr. Edinger was very interested in. So you can start to get a sense of that by finding the Edinger talk. So thank you, Grenade. And then Terrence says, I think your essay on Trump as the rope dancer is in tune with the humor contained in thus spake. There's true, maybe. Yes, maybe. I think I was also talking about what was it, the 13th century Chinese scroll of the dragons, which is very interesting. And I think that was in that same essay, but I'm not sure. I don't remember exactly at the moment. But anyway, it's on, if you go to archetypeinaction.com and go to featured authors, since I created the whole website, I featured myself, as you might guess. And so if you go into my featured authors section, you can find a whole list of all the different essays that I put on there. It's a couple hundred of them that are mine. Grace says, I think you ought to start a Philemon Twitter. I'll have to think about that one. That's not a bad idea, though. Terrence says the other channel is Forever Young. Yes, correct. Thank you, Terrence. That's right. It's Forever Young. And it's got some very good material on it. I completely concur with that. I've listened to several of their things. Okay, I'm not sure I understand all your acronyms there, Gray, but anyway, that is a very good channel also. And I guess what I'm doing nowadays is a little different. One is I'm offering myself to conversations like this so that people can interact with me. And God knows what I'm saying in all these things, because once I get going, it's all coming from the self. It doesn't come from my ego. So, what happened when I was really editing all my Sammy's sessions is I would come out of Sammy's and I would say, my gosh, I can't remember a single thing I said all evening. And that's what happens in a session like this. I have no idea what I've been saying all evening. And the reason is that it's coming from myself. It doesn't come from my ego. And so, then I go back and say, that's good. Or, gee, I really shouldn't have said that. But that really happens. And right, original gangsta Skip. Okay, I guess I better shut up here. I've been carrying on for quite a while, and I have been reading. At the beginning of this, I was reading Death from the Red Book by C.G. Jung, Reader's Edition, pages 262 to 268 of the Reader's Edition. And it is chapter 6 of Liber Secundus. There are 21 chapters of Liber Secundus. And so there's quite a lot yet to read, but I'm planning to go through it all because I think it's important, and also because it's had quite good feedback on the YouTube channel. And so anyway, thank you for joining me today, and I'm going to terminate. Maybe I'll read something more tomorrow, but I do have a couple of interviews that I have to edit, so I have to move on. So Have a good day, and thank you all for your kind super chat gifts. I really appreciate that.